Doing this again, huh? It's Tuesday, June 16th. This is Shawn Schwaner, and I know you are social environment, and based upon that, I hope you all had a great weekend. Also, hope you had a chance to watch that movie, The Two Escobars. I think it was fantastic. So as you sign in, just give us a quick hello, a quick good morning, and we're going to make some things happen. I'm actually going to, of all things, I'm actually going to lecture on some material. I just kind of woke up today, since I've been writing this report. Homicide is in my mind. Hey, Rosa. So, you know, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about homicide in Raging Stream. Good morning, Isabella, Emily, Angelica. Hope you all are doing well. Hope all the assignments are going fine for you. I know that I tried to make some modifications that would be good for all of you. And I'm still I'm still busting away on this report. It's at I think when I logged off this morning, I'm on the 70th page, and I still have about 40 or 50 pages left to write by Friday. So it'll end up being a good 120 pages. And brother, oh brother, oh brother. Oh, hey Sarah, Laura, Isa. Nice to see you all this morning. Terrific. Well, I hope that topic's okay to discuss today. I know that it seems pretty timely. You know, there's a lot of, at least publicly, you know, we're seeing, Jessica, good morning. We're seeing a lot of violence on the TV, particularly pertaining to the protests, and I guess they're still raging. And on top of that, you know, I don't watch the news, so the only time I hear about things that are going on, because the reason I don't watch the news is strictly because back in 2016, there was so much, hey Rose, there was so much negativity surrounding the presidential campaign that I just said, you know what, I'm tired of feeling negative, and every time I turn on the TV, hey Nicole, my friends are going at it with one another, and I'm down all the time. I said, why am I down all the time? And every time I look, you know, there's something on social media or something on the TV that was just outright depressing, so I stopped watching the news a long time ago. What's amazing is, here's what's funny, is that the news hasn't changed, right? Hey Raul, Laura, good morning everybody. You know, nothing has changed. What if you were to go back, and I used to do this as an assignment for my criminology class, what we do is I have you pick a number between 0 and 100, and you pick 37 or whatever, let's say 40. And what I have you do is I have you go back and do a report based upon what happened in terms of crime on your birthday in the year 1940, right? Or I'll have you take a look at crime in 1972, or, hey Andrea, good morning. And what we found was, and what was so amazing about patterns of crime, you know, if you go back, and you can do this on your own, if you go back in time and you take a look at your birthday and you pick any year, hey Mariana, every piece of information you're going to get almost always has to do with murder. Almost always has to do with homicide. So if we go back in time, hey Ashley, good morning. If we go back in time, we would find that the pattern of crime production, that is, you know, media production, is always homicide, is always violence. Wow, everyone's just kicking in today. Isabel and Kayla, hey, good to see you all this morning. So, you know, we look historically at how crime is portrayed, and it's almost always violent. And so in my sociology of murder, well, it's not the sociology of murder, it's human behavior. What we do in that class, hey Laura, what we do in that class is if death had a face, what would it look like? And they write an assignment on that. If murder had a face, what would it look like? If murder victim had a face, what would it look like? And then what we do is we read these papers from one another, and we come out with, it's cultural, right? Largely driven by religion, media presentation, depictions, and a lot of cultural icons. Like the Grim Reaper is the ultimate icon, right? Then followed by Satan. When you're talking about murder, oftentimes Satan makes an appearance, but almost every single semester the Grim Reaper does. And when we're talking about violence, what's so fascinating about it is that the imagery that they use almost always has to do with a gun, correct? So it's almost firearms, some kind of firearm issue that we see when they write these papers up. Hey, good morning, Emily. And so when they write these papers, we have guns, we have a lot of blood, we have a lot of violence. So then I ask them to come up with the title of a movie and then pretend that they're going to write a script. And then they have to draw the picture, like the cover photo that you would if you were going into a movie theater. And what's amazing is that when we say conjure up an image of violence, we always think in terms of interpersonal forms of violence, right? Bodily harm. That's how we tend to think of violence. And the more we think of violence in terms of bodily harm, the more we're going to detract our own attention away from other forms of violation. Because if you really think about it, there's also psychological violence, right? There's emotional violence. But there's one form of violence that we never think about as far as being a violation of what it is to be a human being. And that is institutional violence. So, for example, is it possible that violence rests right in the very institutional system that we experience? In other words, do you think it's a violation that in Miami that graduation rate is 80% from high school? Why isn't it 100%? What is the disadvantage of education if somebody doesn't graduate? What do their long-term prognostics look like? What's their long-term future look like if you don't get an education? What about economic deprivation? Is that not a form of violation? What about the fact that we're back to a point where 30% of Americans don't have health insurance? So we live in this society where we have all this wealth, all this abundance, yet still not everybody has access to health care. Economic inequality is so strong. The division between the wealthy and the poor, since going back to 1980, in 1984, I think it was, in 1984, the average income of a CEO compared to the mean income of their employees was about 35. There's, difference between about 35 times, which is a lot of money, but nonetheless. Now it's 350. You mean to tell me a CEO is worth 350 times more than the average employee of any company? That may be, but I don't think so. I mean, okay, I like KFC with the rest of them. When I was at University of Louisville, but when I was at Sullivan University, we had a culinary program, and Yum Brands was really directly across the street. And Yum Brands at the time was comprised of, and you've heard of them, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Pizza Hut, Taco Bell, and back then it was Long John Silver's and A&W, right? Well, why is that important? Well, here's the reason why. David Novak, who is the CEO, because you like chicken and because you like pizza, his average income was $76 million a year. Now, I'll eat chicken with the best of them. I like chicken. I like the extra crispy fried chicken. I like Popeye's chicken. But is he making so many decisions, such vast decisions, that he's worth $76 million while the janitor is making $9, $10, $11 an hour, right? Keeping the place clean. So when we look at economic deprivation, right? How many people suffer because of deprivation, because of poverty, right? Have you ever taken a look at, for example, the suicide rate? So when I think of violence and we think of interpersonal forms of violence, we tend to think in terms of homicide. So if I were to ask you to list the first three crimes that come to your mind, my guess would be is that you're going to list homicide, you're going to list robbery, probably perhaps rape or something like that. But you're going to list homicide. 92% of everybody will always put homicide as one of their three crimes that they keep in mind, right? So when we think of violence, when we think of violation, it's homicidal, which is me killing you or you killing me. However, we never talk about suicide in terms of lethal violence, right? So if we were to say self-directed anger kills more people than outer-directed anger, then we'd have to take a look at ourselves a lot differently in how we conjure up crime and how we look at violence. Because here's the facts. Last year, the homicide rate in the United States was 5.4 per 100,000. You don't know if that's a lot or a little, and I don't know if that's a lot or a little. But if I put it into a historical perspective, it's really very safe. As a matter of fact, in the 1950s, the 1950s homicide rate was like 4.5 per 100,000 or something like that. Very low. And now we're just a little bit higher than it was. As a matter of fact, in 2016, our homicide rate hit its nadir, which is low, when it hit 4.3 4 per 100,000, making the year 2016 one of the safest years in America, right? So when we watch the news, and the news keeps telling us about all this violence, this violence, this violence, this violence, it really distorts what may actually be taking place. Because if you take a look at historically, the highest homicide rates in the United States occurred in 1980, again in 1992, and in 1930. And it peaked at about 10.4 per 100,000, which is a big number, right? And then it is reduced down to 4.4 per 100,000. So if you get in a conversation with somebody and you talk about murder, what have you, everyone, just about everyone's going to tell you that it's getting worse. Everything's exploding. It's getting worse, it's getting worse, it's getting worse, it's getting worse. You realize that Miami had, 51 homicides in the year 2019. 51! 39 firearm-related deaths. 39. Is that a lot or a little? Well, when you consider that there were 500 and 600 people murdered during the 1980s during the Cocaine Cowboys, when you take a look at 51 murders in Miami is the lowest it's been since 1967. The rate in Miami just went down to 9.7 per 100,000. Even in 2000, it had been going down. I know these numbers because I read about them all the time. So if you go back to the year 2000, say 2005, homicide rate in Miami is about 19 per 100,000. Just to give you a little bit of, what does that mean? The national rate in 1990, or in the year 2000, the national rate was about 5.5 per 100,000. That meant that Miami was 4 times more dangerous when it came to homicidal violence, right? So if we take a look at that, since then, the rate of homicide had been going down. And around 2009, it actually looked like it was going to plummet. So it hit, I don't know, it was 14 per 100,000. And then it went back up to 19. But the question was why? Why? Did something fundamentally change in Miami? Did people already all of a sudden become more hateful than ever before? I don't think so. I think there's something that must have taken place, right? So if we take a look at the nation, and we're looking at homicide rates, you always establish a baseline, right? You can't talk about crime. It drives me crazy when people talk about crime, because they don't know what they're talking about. All they know is what they're looking at on 48 Hours. Oh my God, and here's the one I always love. So they start watching 48 Hours, and I'm riding the bus, I might read a criminology book, and people always tell me, oh yeah, man, you know, when I watch 48 Hours, hey Daniel, what's up, baby? What's going on, man? Haven't seen you in a long time. Thanks for tuning in. They always tell me, you know what, man? I love those crime shows. And you know what? I always solve the mystery before they do in 48 Hours. I'm like, whoa, why aren't you pursuing a job in that then? Oh my gosh, if you can solve crime within 48 hours more than they can on TV, you must be a special mind. Go get a job in it. And so, obviously, it's not that easy to solve them. You know, by the way, how do you solve homicide? Most homicides get solved because of the fact that the victim knows the offender. How hard is that? Right? If it's friends killing friends, that's your number 1 category of homicide. Husbands kill wives, that's your number 2 category. When you take out stranger-related, all right? Stranger-related tend to be felony homicides where there's a robbery that takes place, what have you, and we don't know the relationship of the offender and the victim. But when we do know, it's friends killing friends. 1. 2, husbands killing wives, right? And we start to take a look at that dynamic. What does that mean? That means anger is directed within our relationships. Okay, so as long as we're looking at the TV, all right, bro. I'm glad to have you, man. It's been a while, Daniel. So as long as we look at the TV, our facts are always wrong because there are no facts. The only thing you can get from the TV is that a homicide took place. That's all you can get. So if we're putting into context, what does 9 mean in the what does 9 per 100,000 mean to the city of Miami? Right? Here's what that means. It's about twice the national rate, which is too high. Right? New York City, for those of you who think New York is so violent, New York sits around 4.5 per 100,000. It's safer than the U.S. Detroit, it's around 50 per 100,000. All right. Washington D.C. is still hovering around 50. East St. Louis is, I think it was like 64 per 100,000. You take a look at New Orleans. New Orleans is up there around 35. My hometown, you all think, Toledo, Ohio. When you think of Toledo, you're not thinking, man, you're not thinking violence. Well, let me put it to you this way. Toledo has a homicide rate 36 per 100,000, which means it's 4 times more dangerous in Toledo than it is here. And why is that? Well, it's pretty easy to explain, given that the rate of poverty in Toledo has gone up so high. Because those of you who don't know anything about Toledo, here's how it works. Toledo is basically just like South Detroit. It's kind of like, it's just a little bit further apart than Fort Lauderdale and Miami, right? So it's about a 55-mile drive to get to Detroit from Toledo. Well, in the 1970s and the 1980s, there was a process called deindustrialization. Now hold on to that word. Maybe I'll write it down for you. Hey, come on over here, baby. Come over here. Deindustrialization. The process of deindustrialization, what that meant is all those factories that used to be in the Midwest and the Northeast, they moved to other countries. They went to Mexico and different places like that. And so when they moved abroad, because they got better tax advantages in Mexico than they did having car companies in Detroit. And look, man, now we're looking at it. We are just now getting over the deindustrialization movement that left places like Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit decimated. I mean, when you lose your whole entire economic base, you're going to have struggle. So the rate of poverty went up. Like if you go to Detroit, Detroit used to be one of the wealthiest cities in America. So if you go back to Detroit, say 1920, 1930, it was booming back then because cars were raising everything up. That lousy school up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, excuse me, Michigan, the reason they were so wealthy is because all that wealth from Detroit transferred over to Ann Arbor. So the economic system was terrific, right? Then you take a look at LA, and the LA homicide rate is something like 13 or 14 per 100,000. So when we take a look at Miami, we're very low now compared to those big cities. Now, of course, you know during the cocaine cowboys, the rate was explosive. I mean, Miami at that time, I think it was like 1978, 1979, got up to around 50 per 100,000, 65 per 100,000, way up in the stratosphere. And it was literally dangerous, but it was 2 cities, right? There was where the wars were taking place between Cubans and Colombians, which, by the way, what was the root of it? The root of it was the pursuit of profits, right? The root of it was that groups of people who had been disenfranchised traditionally needed a way to generate income. So what did they do? Cocaine. Everyone was doing cocaine back in the 70s. And then when it became cheaper because of crack cocaine, then it drove down the price, it drove up the usage rates, and the reason there was so much homicide related to crack cocaine wasn't just because of the crack cocaine. It was because there were no clearly established territorial lines. So you had gangs and you had these different organizations that were competing for neighborhoods for economic purposes, right? They were competing with one another so they could generate more profit from crack cocaine. And let me tell you something, man. Let me tell you something. Crack cocaine was destroying this place. Not just here, but all over the nation. I remember in 1982, I was waiting for the bus because I rode the school bus going to school. And I'm waiting for the bus, and this dude's standing next to me, and he goes, "Hey, man," talking to another guy. And there's 3 of us. I'm looking over at him. He goes, "Man, I tried this new drug last night." I'm like, "Oh, shit, what did you try?" And he's looking, and I'm looking. He said, "Man, I tried this stuff called crack." I said, "Crack?" So what's crack? I've seen everything, because my neighborhood had a lot of drugs in it. And I said, "Crack? What the hell is crack?" He said, "Yeah, man, it's just this little cocaine rock, man, that you smoke and you burn it, and it's great high." And he's like, "Man, I need to try it." As it ends up, so many of my friends that I grew up with, because remember, I grew up in the inner city, right? A lot of my friends became addicted to crack. And now I went up to Toledo in 2000, I think it was 2017, and the opioid addiction situation is just ridiculous. I mean, the rate of overdose up there is exceptionally high, nationwide. Okay, let's look at that for a second. So last year, 2019, 14,500 people were murdered. Okay? That's a big number. But there were 32,000 suicides last year, right? But we're not hearing about the suicides. But by extension, 75,000 people died of opioid addictions. Now watch this. While we're sitting here focused on homicide as our form of violation, instead of taking a look at how institutions violate us as well, right? Instead of taking a look at these other forms of violation, a lot more people are angry with themselves to kill themselves, right? So I want to know, what's the root of their pain? What is their pain? And then if we take a look at opioid addiction, what's the root of their pain? Okay, so if we're really going to get down to violence and the value of life, why are we looking at the things that are most likely to kill us? Let's go another step further. So we want to take a look at opioid addiction. Man, you realize 3,000 people have to start smoking every day to replace the number of people who die today from smoking. In a given year, 350,000 people will die from smoking-related illnesses. It's perfectly legal though, right? Crack cocaine, you know how many people die from cocaine overdoses in a given year? About 5,000. About 5,000. So the question is, where do we direct our attention and why? And here's the other thing. When I ask those students to give me like one social or demographic characteristic of a killer, right? And you can do it, just do it at home. Write down a note to yourself. One characteristic of a killer. Just write it down, right? Mostly what we come up with are they're crazy, they're psychopathic, they're sociopathic, they have, some kind of psychological dysfunction, always something like that, right? And the reason is simple is because when you turn on the news or you watch one of these crime shows, man, you're always dealing with people who have stuff going on up here, right? We always want to know what's going on in the criminal mind. Why did they do it? Why did they kill 5 people? Why did he go to the top of a hotel and gun down 500 people? Why? Why does this kid walk into a school up in Fort Lauderdale and kill 20-some people? Why? What made him do it? What made him snap? And as horrible as those situations are, right, and they are horrible, they divert our attention away from what the real root is. Because if we take a look at it from a psychological perspective, a couple things happen. One, we're always looking to see why the crazy people did it. Okay, so if I'm not crazy, but they are, that means I can divert attention away from my bad behaviors, from the things that I do, and I can divert it over there, right? That's what talk shows used to do, man. Maury Povich and all these guys. What was the one show? The mayor from Cincinnati. What was that dang show called? Doesn't even matter. Everyone would get in a fight out there, right? And the functionalists, because I had you look up the functionalist theory, right? The functionalists make an argument that we have dysfunction so that we can see what's normal. So what we do is we have deviance, and we look at deviance so that we can feel better about ourselves, so that we can feel better about the fact that we follow the rules and the regulations, and because of that, we deserve to have some better things in life, right? But if we focus on them, that is, murderers, as crazy, that means we look away from the system that impacts who we are, okay? And then we do the same thing with suicide. Suicide's a lot more complicated than people say. A lot of times, and I've known more people who have committed suicide than have been murdered. But if I rip out my book here, if I bring this book out that I wrote, oh jeez, see this one, A Mother Cries? All right, the first few pages, all I do is list all the lives that were lost of my friends, right? So it starts out like this. It goes, "Today I awoke to the cries of a friend never met. Her son's death 8 years removed haunted her waking and sliced solace into her loving soul. Majestic at birth and tainted by life, our spirits arise, walk and die in various and sundry ways." This treatise, this book, is designed to reconceptualize the traditional view of homicide, examine the academic conceptualization, and examine how the stream of lethality is replete with common and uncommon assumptions about life, death, and other. So when I wrote that book, I listed about 10, 12 people I knew who had been murdered. But then there's probably 20, 30 people I know who committed suicide. I mean, here's what you should really think about. for somebody to get to the point where they're going to end their own life, you got to wonder, what path did they walk? How did they internalize that anger and direct it towards themselves? Because usually when there's a suicide note that's left, they will say that I failed. I failed my family. I failed my loved ones. I failed. They would be better off without me. Now think about that. They would be better off without me. And when you get to that kind of internal self-talk, it requires a lot of different types of restructuring of the way in which we speak to ourselves. Because our greatest enemy isn't our enemy. Our greatest enemy is ourself. And if you take a look at the people who have mistreated you the most, the people who have mistreated you most are the ones that love you, right? So when we take a look at who is the one that's going to cause us the most pain, it is the persons that are in our lives. And oftentimes it's our family, it's our parents. Look, I've been in a lot of situations. Oh my God. Well, you started reading Dear Mama, so you've seen some of the situations. Those 3 guys were going to try to sodomize me over by an abandoned factory, and I got away because the ice cream truck came, and I ran to the ice cream truck. That was a crazy situation. You know, I've had knives put up to my throat, guns put up to my head when I was in Detroit. Girlfriend and I, we got held up at gunpoint. The guy was going to kill us because she flicked him off when he was passing. Oh, I just said, don't do that. Don't flick people off on the road. You don't know what they're up against. You don't know what kind of strain they're going through. But, you know, I've looked at all these scenarios, and the people who ended their own life traditionally look at themselves as having failed, right? And in their failure, and this is where people really disagree with me, and that's okay. It takes a lot of courage, I suppose, to actually pull the trigger, right? And at that point, you would find that a lot of times there's alcohol in their system, okay? So that alcohol becomes the social lubricant for ending one's life, okay? But homicide, oh, by the way, with homicide, check this out. 50% of all homicides that take place, alcohol is involved, right? The 50% of all offenders and 50% of those victims who die from homicide, half of them were under the influence of alcohol, right? So we never take a look at the role of alcohol. Hey, good morning, Kevin. We never take a look at the role of alcohol in violent crime. We don't look at it as a social lubricant that allows people to act out angrily. Because what I want to know is, I don't want to know if they're crazy or not. I don't. We're all a little crazy, you know what I'm saying? What I want to know is, what was the internal conversation that they were having? I want to know, what is the source and the root of the pain? 75,000 people died last year from opioids, and we want to control the opioid? Seems to me that we need to be taking a look at, where's the pain coming from? If 30,000 people kill themselves, if 75,000 overdose, where's that pain? Why aren't we dealing with the pain? Why are we sitting here focusing on crazy people, killing people, rather than taking a look at the broader patterns, right? Because there is a broader pattern. You know, if I were to ask you, is violence random, right? You say, yeah, it's random. Anyone could die. You could die here, you could die there, you can die anywhere. Well, that's true and that's not true, right? Because when I talk about crimes, I talk about the odds, the rate. I don't talk about individual cases because I want to know what are the patterns, right? So, I've had you look up functionalism, I've had you look up conflict theory and symbolic interactionism, right? Basically, conflict theory would basically make the argument that the poor are more likely to engage in homicide because they're alienated from the workforce, and because they're alienated and because they experience disengagement from their income, and our self-value is defined by income a lot of the times. I mean, we judge one another based upon the car we drive, the house we live in, all these kind of arbitrary and capricious things. And so if I judge myself based upon feeling alienated, I'm much more likely to lash out with anger outwardly. So persons who are alienated are much more likely to act outwardly than inwardly. Okay? So, if I want to take a look at why are people killing, I want to know what's the root of alienation. in these communities where you have the highest rates, what is the source of the alienation? And if you give me the numbers, because we've done it elsewhere. I drove down, not I, me and my team, we got all the figures together for Columbus, Ohio way back in 1993, 94, and we drove down the homicide rate in Columbus by about 50%. Then when I lived in Louisville, Kentucky, we actually won a Distinguished Citizens Award for our work. We're nationally recognized because we drove down the homicide rate, the raw number, from 66 in 1998 all the way down to 32. And here's what we did. We took a look at what was the source of the alienation. Where was things breaking down? Hey Samuel, where were things breaking down in the system? And so what we did was, instead of arresting everybody for petty crime, which is what they were doing, zero tolerance meant there was zero tolerance for you, baby. So we're going to arrest you if you do something wrong. And here's how it all started. Back then, I was regarded as a gang expert. I knew everything there was about gangs. I don't so much anymore because they've changed and transformed. But I'm sitting in this town hall meeting with all the local leaders, including the police and the mayor and all these people, teachers and stuff like that. I'll answer that in just 1 second. Let me answer that in just 1 second, because that's a great question, Samuel. And I'm sitting here, and they're talking about there was a shooting in the school, Iroquois, and it was a gang-related shooting. And the gang that did the shooting, their color was orange. So they mandated, hey, Raina, they mandated that no one be allowed to wear orange. And so I said, why is that? They said, well, that's their color. I said, well, okay. I said, are you going to cut their hands off too? And they're like, what? I said, well, when they hug each other in the hall, you do know that they write their gang sign on the back of the person. So if the teacher's standing behind you and you're hugging, and you write on the back of on their back with your fingers, how are you going to know that they're doing that? I said, let me ask you another question. I said, let's get down to this. And they're all looking at me like I'm a freak show, and I'm like, yeah, whatever. And so I said, how many gangs are there in Louisville? One person goes, there's about 500. Another one goes, well, there's about 3,000. I said, okay. So it's 500 or 3,000. I said, well, how many gangs are there? And one person goes, there's 3 gangs. And they're the big ones, right? And then another one goes, there's 500 gangs. I'm like, so let me understand this. I said, so you might have 2 gangs with 2,500 people in them. Or you might have 500 gangs with 1 person in them. Because you said there's 500. I said, so really we don't have any idea what we're talking about. Yet still you're gonna pass policies to drive down the homicide rate when you don't even know what the nature of the problem is. How are you going to address a problem if you don't know what the nature of it is? So they said, well, what do you know? I said, I'll tell you what, I'll figure it out for you. I said, you give me the statistics I need, and you let me figure out what the underlying trends is. Now, coming back to Anomie here in just a second, all right? Alienation is separation from society, right? Where you don't feel like you belong. You feel anger because of the fact that, your work position is so poor, such that, you're never going to have upward mobility. And alienation has 4 levels of alienation. There is alienation from society, alienation from self, alienation from work, and alienation from nature. And you got to think, when you feel alienated from nature, that you don't even belong here, then there's going to be some anger that's going to flow out of you. All right? So that's where that alienation comes from. That's a conflict theory. Anomie is a different concept, and this is for you, Samuel. Anomie, what that is the term is defined as societal breakdown, right? A loss of normative systems. Okay? So when anomie takes place, that means there's a change in the norms. So there's a sense of normlessness. So people will respond to the normlessness violently, right? So if there's societal breakdown, then people are going to respond, and in this case, with homicide, all right? So whichever explanation you use is fine, because they're very similar type of terms, right? But they're not, well, they are experienced by individuals, but they're more of an aggregate type term, right? So if you want to figure out how to solve homicide in a community, you got to take a look at the starting point, which is the institutional system, right? So what we did in Louisville is I took a look at all the institutions. First one I always look at, What's the economic distribution? Where are the poor areas? Where's the median income the lowest? Where's poverty the highest? Where single female headed households, where are they primarily located? What's the average education level within each area? Because what you will find is, you'll find this congregation of these social problems in one place. That's your social environment. It can be found in one specific place. They're called hotspots. So within these hotspots, what happens is that people come together with the same background. So if you have anomie, which is where there's societal breakdown, then what's going to happen is that you're going to see a surge in crime, right? But if the institutions are working well together and there's stability, then you're not going to see the surge in crime. And for the last, since 1992, our homicide rate has gone down like this. Now the question as to why homicide rates have gone down, even though the conditions for it have appeared periodically. Well, there's one major factor. There's one major factor that really has a huge impact on crime. Two, really. Number one is age. What is the average age of the population? Now that the baby boomers, I'm not a baby boomer, I'm a Generation X by 3 weeks. January 1st, 1966 was Generation X, so I'm an Xer. Pretty close to a boomer, I'm right at the tail end of all that kind of stuff. Well, the baby boomers were the largest part of the population. This is what we call a demographic. I'm doing what is called a demographic analysis right now, okay? It's a demographic analysis. In other words, demography will predict the future. Demography predicts destiny, right? So if the average age of the population now is older than it was in 1990, just by virtue of being older, it's going to drive down the overall homicide rate. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing is there's a theory called routine activities theory. So on the one hand, we become older as a society, right? And by the way, that's the same reason why the suicide rate has gone up, because the group that is most prone to suicide, the highest rate, is those 45 to 54 years old, right? So if you have baby boomers coming up and through the system, and the highest rate of suicide is for 45 to 54 years old, and you have a lot of people in that age category coming through, the rate of suicide is going to go up, right? Not because of policy, but because of the age structure of society. So we take a look at age structure, take a look at the economic structure, and I'm looking at all these factors. And then what you do is you take a look at where are the homicides being found, where do they take place, where. There's a distribution to this. So, routine activities. The second partial explanation, and this is where your generation has really had a huge impact on crime, routine activity theory. Routine activity theory basically says, what are the routines that criminal offenders engage in, or what are the routines that victims engage in that increases their odds of victimization, right? So if we go back to 1990, I feel so old when I talk about this, oh my God. Okay, so we go back to 1990, and here's what you would discover is immediate, right? First thing is, there wasn't an internet, baby. I was still typing on a typewriter in 1987. My paper's on a typewriter. In 1987, we had this great big computer, and finally, Aaron Larimore, he goes, man, you got to start typing on a computer, man. You can't keep typing. I said, whatever. And then my papers were getting longer, so because I used to write a lot, so when we'd get a term paper assignment, I'd write 30, 40, 45 pages for my term paper, and I usually did it in one night. So I'd sit down and I'd just type, and people were like, you typed 33 pages last night? I was like, yeah. I got to type another 20 today. They're like, what? I'm like, oh man, it's outlines, man, outlines. Everything that I showed you in that video, how to write a great paper, is exactly how I write. That's how I can write a 25-page paper in 8 hours. Is just sit down and map it out and then go do it. So Aaron's like, man, get on the computer. I'll teach you how to do these, what are they called, the PF keys or whatever they were called back then. So I started learning. I get a little more comfortable. I go to grad school. Everyone's on a computer. They're brand new. I think email had just come out. I don't even remember. But the internet didn't exist. So the internet starts to come out around 1994, the World Wide Web, and everyone's like, what is this thing? We don't know how to do it. It's so natural now, right? This whole class is based upon internet technology. But what it did was, what the internet did was, and what gaming has done, is it has changed the way in which we engage in public and private space, so that your generation is a lot more likely to be engaged in private behaviors, whereas my generation, we are much more likely to engage in public behavior. So therefore, when you're out in public playing football, basketball, let me tell you what, every time you start playing football, basketball, and you tackle your best friend and you rub their face into the cement, or they rub your face into the cement, well, something amazing happens. You get mad, and you punch them in the face or something like that, or they punch you. Next thing you know, you've got this escalation thing going, right? So when you take a look at the context being as it was in the 80s, the 70s and the 80s, man, it was fun. Don't get me wrong, boy, I had a blast in the 70s and the 80s, but it was dangerous. It was dangerous. And it shown in the crime rates, okay? So we take a look at the routines that people engage in. And your age group now is a lot more technologically savvy. I mean, you got the Switches, you know, you've got Nintendo, you have Xbox, you have all these different game systems. What's that called? Alienware, NVIDIA. Buy it, because I'm invested in NVIDIA. So you have all these games that pulls you out of the danger, right? So what does that mean? The routine activities. If the routines are those who are most homicidal, 16 to 30. If you're playing games in your home in public, we didn't have to pass any policy. All we had to do is let you play, right? So you have two forces, massive forces that are taking place in terms of social environment in the United States. One, artificial intelligence, gaming, all those kind of things is changing the routines, and we're getting older. Those two forces alone will drive down the homicide rate and push up the suicide rate. See how that works? Right? So what that is that's using theory to explain something like homicide and suicide. Now, I actually subscribe to what is called stream analysis. And stream analysis, it's not more complicated, but it's a lot more effective in terms of explaining, because when I can find how the stream is flowing through a community, then if I have the buy-in from the mayor, then what we can do is the mayor will direct resources into the domains that we need to fix to drive down violence, right? So in Miami, and well, in Louisville, what we did is in Louisville, they gave me everything I needed. I came up with the yeah, you know what, Ashley, that's a great question, right? And I've had to toy with it. And, you know, because of my daughters, I'm a huge Pokemon fan, right? So I watched Pokemon when they were little. I'd watch real closely. I'm like, they're not fainting, they're dying, man. They're getting blasted all over the place. And then I watched My Hero Academia, and I'm like, oh, wow. Let's look at whew, fantastic, but it's violent. It's very violent. If you've ever watched it, the villain Stain, oh my God, he's over here stabbing people in the arm and cutting out their brains, and I'm like, whoo, that's pretty hot, right? So one of the questions, and it's a great question, it's kind of like the question that they say, does TV cause violence, right? All right, so we'll just break it down fundamentally. On the individual level, there's two theories as to whether or not video games cause violence. Right? One is called catharsis, and the other one's called disinhibitor. Right? So those who believe that watching violence causes violence believe that games are disinhibitors. It shows us, it gives us a script to engage in violence. My personal feeling is that script just supports other scripts of violence that already exist out there in our society. Right? The catharsis theory says that people who would have a violent tendency can take their violence out on the game and therefore don't have to do it to other human beings. So here's how I do it, Ashley, to answer that question. Back in 1985 or 1986, there was a study, and I had to do this for my introduction to sociology class. We had to break down an academic article, and then we had to determine whether it was accurate or whatever, and look at the strengths and the weaknesses. And there was an article on how watching boxing on TV increases the rate of violence. And I said, well, that's kind of a spurious relationship, right? Because Muhammad Ali hits somebody in the face, does that drive up the violence? Well, the theory is that when you provide another script for violence and you support it by throwing money at the combatants, then what happens is it's going to drive up the violent crime rate. So the question back then that I asked, does TV cause violence? And it was real simple, right? TVs came out in 1954 when homicide rate was at its lowest, okay? And so when civil rights and all the, and this is for you, Samuel, when we experienced anomie in the 1960s, all this breakdown, there was a surge in violent crime all across the nation, right? That coincided with the rise of the TV. But it just so happens that after the 1990s, everyone owns a TV, except for me. Well, I own one, it doesn't work. Bought a brand new, didn't return it in 7 days, so now I'm sitting here with this TV behind the couch because whatever. So anyhow, instead of violence continuing upward, it came back down. So if the TV was causing the violence, then the crime should have continued going up. And now that, and this is a macro perspective, it's not an individual level perspective. So actually, when I take a look at the homicide rate, and gaming. So gaming takes off, but the homicide rate has continued to go down. So if people are playing the violent games, then there should be a surge in the number of people who are engaging in homicidal violence, and it just hasn't worked out that way. So maybe, I would say on the margins, okay, marginal behavior. On the margins, where there are a few people that are sitting way out here, out of the normative system. They can be either deeply alienated or they can be ingesting anomie, however you want to look at it. But they're all the way on this margin, right? Some of those people will be triggered, right, by the game on an individual level. But in mass, it probably won't happen. It didn't happen, right? And there's some really, I always want to call it Death Race 2000. Grand Theft Auto, that's it. That's a violent game, baby. That's a violent game. But we haven't seen the explosion in violence because people watch Grand Theft Auto, right? It's the same thing with pornography, right? So people say, well, just about everyone who engages in rape views pornography. Well, that's kind of circular reasoning, right? Because pornography is so widespread that it's hard to say that there's a causal linkage to it. Instead, like they say, well, Ted Bundy used it. Well, okay. Ted Bundy used it. Hold on a second. It's my boss. I'll just have to call him back. Ted Bundy used it, but if pornography caused so much sexual assault, then no one would be safe, right? But here's what we know. Here's what we know when it comes to sexual assault. I tend to think of it in terms of structural terms, not pornography causing it, because it's so widespread that if the pornography caused it, then there'd be sexual crime all over the place, and there is, but it's kind of tricky. So, how do I answer the question about pornography and sexual assault? I do the same thing. Here's what we know statistically. Statistically, 30% of women who only have a high school degree and never went to college, 30%, have been the victims of attempted or completed rape. 30%, right? That's a huge number. Huge number. For college women, it's 20%. For men who only have a high school degree, it's 16%. And then those who go to college, it's about 13%, right? So I take a look at these numbers, and it seems to me that education level has a direct impact on patterns of victimization. Here's another one that they never discuss. They never talk about a violent crime, and they never talk about it with suicide. But if you want to look at the top predictors, it's not games. It's called childhood trauma. Right? One of the most influential variables on violent crime and suicide too, is childhood trauma. The question is, what is childhood trauma? There are 10 factors. There are 10 factors that count towards childhood trauma. 1, physical abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, alcoholic parent, drug addicted parent, incarcerated parent, what's the other one? Poverty, and I can't remember. There's one more I can't think of right offhand. Me personally, right? 12% of the population has had 4 or more traumas. About 33% have had 0. So that's a very lucky group. So 67% of us have had some kind of trauma. The more traumas you have, the worse your outcomes are in terms of quality of life. I had 7, right? When you read through Dear Mama, you're going to see my dad was incarcerated. He committed suicide. Everyone in my family was alcoholic. No one used drugs. Well, there were some on Mama Green's side that used drugs, but my grandmother was a drug addict. You know, I got beaten regularly, hospitalized a few times, psychologically definitely abused, emotionally ridiculously when I was in high school. Things got very complicated in high school. So I was taking a look at it, and we were poor, right? So I had 7 traumas in my childhood. My mother tried to murder me when I was 15 years old. It was the battle of a lifetime. You can read about it. It's in chapter, I can't remember the number of the chapter, but it was called The Morning Childhood Died. And it was all because, I'm not going to get it. I got to stand up to act this one out, right? There's a video out there on Shawn Schwaner, on YouTube on Shawn Schwaner, that actually has the 44-minute version of what really took place that particular day. And so, so she tries to kill me or what have you. Stuff sits with you, man. It sits in your head. Because I'm sitting here saying, oh my gosh, if my mother wanted to whack me, I must not be very valuable to the world. I'm definitely not valuable to her. And I said, man, why do I even exist? So I think about ending myself back when I was 15 years old. And Dr. J, Julius Erving, basketball player, it was in April or May. They were playing the Boston Celtics in Game 7. And I just wanted to see, because whoever won was going to the championship against the Lakers. And so that was if you go back and watch YouTube, that's the game where the Boston Celtics fans start chanting, beat LA, in celebration of Dr. J and the Sixers going on to play the Lakers. So that was the day that I was going to off myself, but I chose instead to call Mama Green. And so I call Mama Green, I'm laying on the floor, I'm in all this blood in the kitchen. My mom had actually ripped my shirt off my back with her nails. It was a 5:30 in the morning attack, completely unsuspecting. That's why I have PTSD. She attacked me from behind, broke a lamp over my head while I was asleep, then wrapped my arms up in the covers while she was just pummeling me, and then she threw me off the bed, flipped everything. It was crazy. It went on for about an hour and a half. So I called Mama Green. I'm laying on the floor. I said, Mom, something terrible happened. She said, what, baby? I said, my mom tried to kill me. She said, I'll be right there. So she brings her gun, and she drops to her knees, and she's like, oh, my Lord, my baby. This can't be happening to my baby. I'm going to kill her. I said, no, you can't kill her. No, I can't. Just help me clean this house up. She bandaged my back. We cleaned the house up. When my mom came home, Mama Green walked up to her, put the gun right up in her face. He said, if you ever touch him again, I'm going to end you, Susie. And then we left, right? And so for me, I had Mama Green to buffer me, to help me with my thinking, to remind me. She had a saying. I'll explain that in a second, right now. Well, actually, I'm going to explain that right now. Is that she would always tell me on a daily basis, you have $1 million personality, never let anyone take that away from you, right? So every day I got hugged and I got held. My mom hugged me. My mom loved me too, Irma Jean. So I was always being hugged. I was always being loved. And when I went to school at Maumee Valley, they knew that there was something going on in my house. They just didn't know what was going on. And when that beating took place, because I was on the sports teams, my advisor's name was Al Getman. I said, Al, what am I going to do? He said, what's wrong, Shawnee? I said, Shawnee. They called me Ween, which was my nickname, and others called me Shawnee, and we went by first names. So his name was Al. I said, hey, Al, I got beaten really badly. And I showed him my back, and he started to cry. And he's like, oh my God. And then he offered to adopt me. My parents were going to rip me out of Maumee Valley later because my grades were falling. My grades went like that. And I was surrounded by all these brilliant people. That's why I never felt smart. I always felt pretty stupid because everyone, we had 32 people in my graduating class. 10 of them went to Ivy League schools after graduation. You feel pretty average when everyone's going to Harvard and Yale and Princeton and stuff like that, and Columbia and Williams. And you're sitting here saying, I'm going to Denison. But you find out Denison's a fantastic school. It's ranked in the top 50. So it's just the way it was. But all those teachers, Al actually had a faculty meeting with the teachers, and he said, we got to take care of our boy. He's going through something that we will never understand, so we got to be there for him. So even though my grades were falling, they supported me in every way possible. And then the other thing that I had is I had sports. You can't tell, if you ever meet me, I'm limping around all the time. My leg is all bowed like a damn bow and arrow, and you can't look at me and see that I used to be able to dunk a basketball. You can't see that I was a 400 hitter and was actually scouted to play professional league baseball. You can't see it. So, Raina, what I really had is I had Mama Green building up my confidence level, my esteem. I had a school that provided me with the resources that I needed so that I could maintain my grades and keep moving forward. Then I had sports. And, now my mom's line is brilliant, right? My mother was brilliant. She had a genius IQ. My uncle was a genius. He was brutally abused. It was sad. His life was one of the saddest I've ever seen. My grandmother, she was brilliant. My grandfather on my father's side wrote this book, right, way back in the 1940s, and I got it off Amazon, and it ended up, we had a lot of intelligence in the family. So, for me, I always had to surround myself with great friends, had great teachers, had Reverend Rose, the pastor, and these persons kept me maintain my confidence level and all that kind of stuff. And I still struggle with things based upon all the stuff that happened back then. But I also know that it wasn't my fault, nor was it my mother's fault. And here's the reason why. Like, I haven't even started talking about what I was going to talk about. This is called the U-shaped curve. All right? And what it is a stream analysis of homicide. If you take a look at this U-shape, homicide rates were at the high in 1930 at 10.4 per 100,000, and again in 1990. But it hit the bottom here, 5, in the 1950s. So the homicide rate did like this over time. And here's why that simple curve is so important. When the homicide rate was going down in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, particularly in the 50s, is because the institutions were working together so very well, right? Full employment, lower levels of poverty, lowest levels in history at that point in time, and things overall were really good. 1960s start, and you have complete breakdown in all the major social institutions, right? Everything's being thrown upside down. Everything's coming apart at the margins. And you have the deindustrialization process that started in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. So now you're having all this massive job loss in the Midwestern cities. You have complete anti-disestablishmentary type of behavior. And now crime is going up. Unemployment's terrible. There was a horrible recession in 1979. Interest rates were about 20%. I mean, it was just, it was unbelievable. You had the oil embargoes. I remember in 74, the oil embargo from OPEC, they shut down our ability to get gas, and the lines to get gas at that point in time, you might have to wait 3, 4, 5 hours to get a gallon of gas, and you're only allowed to get 1 or 2 gallons. So you had everything breaking down, and therefore the rates of homicide started to go up, right? What that means is this. Enrico Ferri in 1903, he said, there's a law of criminal saturation, right? The law of criminal saturation, and that is crime rates will fluctuate between a maximum and a minimum period unless there's a massive change in the institutional system. So it's never going to go above 10.4 per 100,000 in the United States because of the way the institutions are. But it's also never going to fall beneath 4. And here's the reason why. All right? It will never fall beneath 4 simply for the fact that there's a line called the domestication of homicide. That is, people who are married to each other hurt each other. The emotional response. So you will never have homicide disappear because at 3 per 100,000, that's the rate of death coming from people who are married to each other or who are estranged or what have you. So all that other stuff happens in felony type of homicide. So when we take a look at felony homicides, It was going up in the 70s and the 80s. Why? Because you had a complete breakdown in the social institutions. And since you had increasing street crime, drug-related homicide, it became more difficult for the police to find the persons who did it. So therefore, the arrest rates went down. The police looked like they're inept, but really what it was the nature of the relationship between victim and offender. So when I see this, I go into a city and I try to take a look at what does the stream look like that we're swimming in this community. What does the stream look like? And when we take a look at the stream, then we can start to see if it's going up, that's because of impersonal relationships. That means there's a breakdown in the economic system. If we see it being more domestic, that means the economics is probably fine, but there's a breakdown in relationships. And if we see suicide going up, that means something entirely different. That means that the cultural system is breaking down. Because in this stream, there are two forces in the stream. All right? I'm going to write this out for you. There is what is called the force of production and the force of direction. All right? When the force of production changes, economic, education, etc., you're going to see an increase in homicide. That's the expression. When lethal violence, that is the number of suicides plus the number of homicides, when lethal violence is being affected by production, then you will see that homicide will be more of the expression. The forces of direction is your cultural beliefs, your socialization patterns, ethics, all those kind of things. So when the ethical systems start to change in society, you're going to see people direct their anger towards themselves because we're taught to blame ourselves for our problems. Instead of looking at the structural cues, we take a look at ourselves. And here's what happens. What happens is that when the forces of direction are stronger, it's more suicide. Forces of production are stronger, more homicide. So all I do is I go take a look at where's the stream flowing through this community. And once I establish how and where the stream is flowing, then I can do something about it. And I can get the buy-in. I'm articulate, especially when it comes to my written work. So I can make a case for about anything. Jessica, thanks for those kind words. I appreciate it. I don't feel very strong, but I do my best. From others, I guess I look strong. I definitely overcame some stuff along the way. But again, I had the greatest life. You know, it was weird because it was always built around the threat of violence. You know, I don't know if I told this class or which class, but once I was about 5 or 6 years old, I asked Mama Green. I said, "Hey, Mom, do you think my mother would kill me if you weren't in my life?" She said, "Oh yeah, baby, she would have." Not because she didn't love you. It's because of all the traumas that she had experienced that they were beating right out of her. Because here's talk about childhood trauma. My mother, poverty, right? She was beaten every single day of her life as a kid, which is, I can't even begin to imagine. Alcoholic grandfather, my boy, Gramps, was an alcoholic dude, drank a lot. My grandmother was an alcoholic, and she was a drug addict. And when my grandfather left her for other women, he was a player. I mean, there's no other way to put it. My dad was a player, my grandfather was a player. It's like, what is going on with these guys? So in any case, she was brokenhearted. And the way violence happens is, it trickles down from the most powerful to the least powerful. So if I'm being victimized, it's hard to internalize that breakdown, that alienation. So what happens is, oftentimes, a battered wife may in fact batter the child, right? Or batter the dog. Then the child will attack the dog, right? Because it has less power. So for my mom, she couldn't do anything with my grandmother, but she sure could do something towards me because all that anger from her horrible childhood was just built up and pent up. So I was the natural target of that aggression. And she tried really hard not to be that way. So the fact that I knew that she loved me did play a huge role, because otherwise I could have just disappeared. And so when you take a look at that, that was one thing. But here's the other thing, and I'm not going to get into this. I was going to get into this. But this is what is called an age crime curve. And essentially what that means is that criminal behavior for property crime peaks at the age of 16, wherever it is. And violent crime peaks at a lower rate, but later, at the age of 18. all right, and then it disappears. That downward descent, God, I can't figure out where my arms are. Okay, the downward descent, there we go, in crime, as you saw, those rates, when they decrease like that, it's called maturation reform. Going back to you, Samuel, when people are allowed to integrate into the workforce, and they get a degree, and they get in a relationship, right? They experience what is called maturational reform, which is essentially this. Maturational reform is the idea that as you get older, you get more responsible, and you have, you get a job, you get in a relationship, you have an education typically, and those things alone give you more responsibility, and therefore you don't have the same time to engage in criminal behavior, right? But not everybody gets the opportunity to mature, right? So what we see is that it never comes back down to zero. The age crime curve never hits the 0 point. All right? And the reason is because there's a small handful of people out there. They're called the chronic offenders. All right? Marvin Wolfgang in 1973 did probably the most important criminal justice research of all time. And what he did was he tracked all 10,000 people born in the city of Philadelphia from 1947, and he followed them through adulthood. And he used their official arrest records to see who gets arrested, who doesn't, and he had all kinds of statistics on everybody. And as it turns out, 5% of the population accounts for 51% of all arrests. Right? 5% account for 51% of all arrests. Now, what is that? What is that 5%? He found that there's a group of people, the 5%ers, who have been arrested 5 or more times. 5 or more times was defined as a chronic offender. And here's what we know. That 5% accounts for 51% of all arrests. They account for 65%, 70% of all burglary arrests, 72% of robbery arrests, and 92% of homicide arrests. So if you really want to take a look at homicide, and you really want to get down, turn off the TV. Because what we know is that when you take a look at social class, education, you take a look at access to the labor market, the people who end up being a chronic offender, those 5% come from those disadvantaged areas. So if they're accounting for 92% of all the behaviors that lead to homicide, or 92% of all the homicide arrests, then us focusing attention on this instead of those conditions is always going to fail. It's always going to fail. And the reason is because there is a pattern for all behaviors. Right? If you take a look at the percentage of companies that account for 50% of all malfeasance from white-collar crime, it's 5% of them. Right? 5% of you are going to go on to be massive superstars. Right? 5% will end up, probably not do so much. Everyone will waver in between. So if you start to take a look at this 5%, right, that 5% accounts for a lot of it. So if you're going to do something about crime, violent crime in particular, then we've got to take a look at what are the conditions of the violent 5%. I mean, it's not hard at all. And then what we realized is if I go back to my own neighborhood, I can get along just fine. You drop me off in an inner city somewhere, I'm good. Don't even worry about it. You drop me off with some CEOs, some professors, I'm fine, no problem, right? But here's what I know. When I come in to a neighborhood, they don't see me the way I see me. They don't know my background. So they see an outsider. And here's what we did in Louisville, here's what we did in Miami, and here's what we did in Columbus, is we find local leaders who are trusted at the street level, right, in those areas where the 5% are found, in that stream. Because we know that there are violent offenders who have turned themselves around. And a lot of those violent offenders are actually leaders within the neighborhoods. So what we've done in the past is we've done a couple things. Instead of arresting everybody, we find the right agency, we do what is called risk assessment, and we send these persons to the social work agencies that's right for them. Not just throw them into a system, what's right for them, and we match them up. We had a clearinghouse where the police would call in and say, okay, here's what I have, which agencies should I call? We had 500 agencies working together to drive down that homicide rate in Louisville. We had the same kind of thing, not to the same degree. It was very effective because we drove it down to, since 2016 to 19, it went all the way down to 9 per 100,000 from 20 per 100,000, right? But what we know is that when you can empower persons in the neighborhood with resources, you give a person some resources, they're called violence interrupters. They understand the triggers because they were once violent, but they also have that human capacity for interpersonal communication. So those persons, they're hard to identify, but they're very powerful. And then when you match them with resources at the community centers or at schools, et cetera, and let them work alongside with the police, instead of arresting every single person, we create integration into the forces of production. And we start to affect the forces of direction, right? And what we've done is that the molecules that hold the water together in the stream are the people. So what we really have to do is we have to work on the social networks of those persons that are in that stream. And when we do that, we drive down violent crime. If we were just focused on their craziness or their mental health instability, we wouldn't be able to solve it, right? So when we understand what the patterns are, what the patterns of chronicity are, and we understand the stream, the U-shaped curve, when we understand these numbers tell us everything we need to know, baby. And you give me some numbers, I'm going to give you a real answer. And when we have that real answer, then we can come up with a real solution. Me, I was a lucky dude, man. I was lucky. I was surrounded, there was so much violence in my neighborhood. My house, the neighborhood, is all we knew. And there was sexual assault everywhere. My best friend Booney was sexually assaulted by his brother for 4 or 5 years, and then his brother assaulted their sister, and then they went down the street and assaulted, and they got a best friend Steve, and they started assaulting, and they're going down assaulting his sister. And my neighbor to the left, he went to prison for sodomizing his son. The neighbor to the right was charged with child molestation as a reverend. And so everywhere, and my mom's best friend or her boyfriend thought I was like cute and stuff. So everywhere we looked, sexual assault was a part of what the neighborhood cultural construct was. And so for Booney and myself, we had to do extra work to not see the world through that lens. And it was very difficult, and it took a lot of reinforcement. It took a lot of positive people, and this is why I tell you, right? This is why I tell my students in the live classes. Right now, somebody is being born in this society. Right now, there's somebody that's going to need the pain that you're going through in this moment. So that what you're going through now is going to help save somebody else's life later. So I think, and I always believe, that you have a moral obligation, because my history of being able to teach you is strictly because of the fact that I had a teacher way back in the day that took me under his wing. I had a woman who was a third grade dropout that carried me wherever I went. So when you take a look at these people, Mama Green was 59 years old when I was born. I'm not even 59 yet. So I don't even know who I'm going to affect. But when you see someone laying, and you used to always tell me this, and I think it's a great saying, never, and she used to say man, but she said, never let a man leave your home hungry. Never judge, never hate, but never let a man leave your home hungry. If you see someone who is in need of your food, you should feed them. Because you don't know if by feeding them it's going to come back and save you later. That's how we're interconnected. So when you see someone laying on the ground, it is your job to pick them up. You got to remember back to your own life. There was somebody that picked you up. Now your job is to pick somebody else up. And if you do that, watch this. If you do that, and if we do it as a society, you by definition are going to drive down homicide. You're going to drive down suicide, and you're going to address and attack the opioid overdose crisis by reaching your hand down to pick somebody else up. So we use coarse material to come up with a answer or solution to the violent crime that we see. Right? Whew, thanks for the questions today, baby. I'm hungry, so it's time for me to get going. There is no live cast, no live stream on Thursday. Right? I'm giving you time to work on your other projects and stuff like that. However, feel free to text me or what have you, and have a great day. Have a great week. And next week, I'm actually going to do the investment video. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to break it down into like 6 segments, so that you can understand. And any of you who are interested in learning about investments, you can call me, and if you want to formally do it, you can call me, you can text me or what have you, because I am trained, and it's my part-time job anyhow. And my partner and I will make sure that you or your family or your friends are getting on track. But that video will be coming out next week, and I'll be darned, we're over halfway done with the semester. Isn't that crazy? So, oh God, can I explain the assignment? Which assignment is it? Let me look it up, okay? Let me look it up. I gotta go. Just hold on a second, Emily, while I look this up. Because I'm teaching 4 classes, I can't remember which assignment is of which class. Come on, baby. Why does my computer always get slow when I have to have it? Are you all enjoying the book, dear mama? Remember, I want some questions on it, so next week I can talk about it. I'm going to spend next Tuesday actually talking about that. All right. This is social environment, correct? So let me go look that up, which is, oh yeah. I'm looking it up, Emily. I'm looking it up. It's not like a live class where I can just jump right in. Oh, okay. All right. Okay. So, Emily, are you still there? Let me see. The 2 Escobars. Here's what I want you to do. It's really easy. It's really easy. So, well, I shouldn't say that because it's not easy, but it is easy. All right. So I just went through and did an explanation of homicide. I explained homicide using both anomie theory and alienation theory, which is conflict theory. But I also was able to develop a solution to homicide and suicide using stream analysis. So for me, stream analysis is the best tool to analyze homicide in Miami or anywhere. So I use it wherever I go. So all you're going to do is you're going to take some aspect of the 2 Escobars movie, and you're going to find a topic from within. And it might be corruption, all right? It might be poverty. It could be interdiction, sports, whatever, okay? But what you're going to do, just like I did with stream analysis and homicide, and you can do political homicide in Colombia, whatever you want to do. But you're going to take either the conflict theory, you're going to take the functionalist theory. You can use stream analysis if you understood what I was talking about today. Or you can use symbolic interaction. Oh, and then you had other ones too. You had dependency theory, modernization theory, world systems theory. So what you're going to do is you're going to take one of those theories and you're going to explain the movie or the topic that you got from within the movie. Oh, Rose asked, does it? Oh my gosh, thanks Emily, you enjoy my book. Where am I? Yes, it's more like a research paper. It sure is. I mean, you're finding the topic, education and poverty in Colombia, right? Go do some research because you're still going to have an introduction, the background, theory, data, analysis, and conclusion. Add me too. Hold on a second. Oh, you love my... Thanks, Emily. I appreciate that. No, you don't have to explain what happened in the movie. All right? As a matter of fact, don't explain the movie. The movie is just there to give you topics. All right? Because if you explain the movie, then you're going to be giving me a descriptive analysis. I don't need the description. What I want is I want to know what are the underlying forces that are at work. What are the underlying structural issues or symbolic issues that are related to your particular topic. I want to be in the group chat. Hold on. I enjoy those. The older I get, the more I'm learning I like stuff. 2579. I don't even know my number. What? And I don't know about you, but I enjoy myself this semester. I wish I could see you. I look forward to the little, you know, I was talking, one of you didn't feel comfortable with the whole idea of the having 5 people you take the exam with. I will Zoom with you as an individual, okay, if you want to do that. Ah, see what happens? Let's see. Okay, I want you to submit 3 questions to me. Oh, okay, it's just yeah, so what I want you to do with the Dear Mama book is the same thing you're doing with the 2 Escobars, right? The 2 Escobars, you're using a theory to explain it. And then what you're going to do is you're going to pick a topic from inside Dear Mama. I don't know what it might be. Education, who knows, violence, sexual assault, you know, child abuse, whatever. And you're going to do the same kind of analysis. You're just going to do a 2 or 3 page paper analysis just like you would with the 2 Escobars. Just that simple, right? It's kind of weird that I'm going to be reading, you know, papers about my book and stuff, but you know what's funny is I've done this in the past, and I have to tell you that some students have written stuff that opened up my eyes. I'm like, wow, that's really fascinating that you could see that, and I couldn't even see it. And so, yeah, feel free. You could even talk about the language system involved, man. I mean, there's some hard words in that book, and I mean, all we did was, not me, the kids weren't allowed to curse. The adults, they cursed. So, let me see if that answered your question. Yes, social disorganization is fine, because even though that's, it's perfectly fine, because social disorganization theory is explaining community structure on patterns of crime, right? So, it's really a descendant of anomie theory, or functionalism. Right? So yeah, social disorganization is perfectly okay. I only gave you 6 theories for this class, but you know, you can use other theories, because really what you're trying to do is explain patterns of behavior. And so by explaining patterns of behavior using social control or disorganization theory is perfectly acceptable. Just email it to me as an attachment. If you can go into the course structure, Jessica, and what's it called? Course called brother, all over the place here. Course messages. All right, if you go into course messages and send it as an attachment, that's perfectly fine. If you want to send it to me at shawn.hopeworks@gmail.com, that's perfectly fine. The due date, all the due dates are in an announcement, but the Dear Mama paper is due the 28th. June 28th. Alright? But that a mother cries, I don't know. Let's see. I think the 2 Escobars was due 2 days ago. I put down here the 2 Escobars is due on June 21st, so that's going to be next Sunday. This Sunday. This Sunday. And then the Dear Mama paper is going to be due the following Sunday. So it's just going to be 2 consecutive 21st. And then we're going to Zoom together on June 30th during our class time. All right? So I hope that helps. Wow. If you don't want